So let's get underway. Yeah. Thanks, Troy.
So it's pretty trite to see this age expectancy graph behind me, which says that we're going to have extra years, we've got a bonus set of years, and somebody mentioned before that there's a longevity dividend. I made the note because most of the stuff I've got to say has already been covered, which is lovely. But how do we actually cash in on that longevity dividend? Of course, one way that we're seeing is that more and more people are choosing to remain in the workforce, and certainly the 2016 review found very clearly that people in that 50-plus bracket expected to stay in the workforce, past 65. One thing that I caution it with, because I primarily deal with retirement village work, is that there is a disability-adjusted life expectancy rate, and the exact source of it I haven't got today, but it says something along the lines that 1 in 5 of us will have those extra years with some degree of care or disability-related issue. So that's something to keep in mind. I think a previous speaker talked about that, and we've just got to deal with that, baby. And one other thing that comes about life expectancy, this graph was referred to by the OECD, and I've noticed in the debate a lot of people like to refer to New Zealand's position in relation to other OECD countries. But the OECD said that financially empowered older people reduce the pressure on our pension schemes. And a point down there, where is it in this? This is the old slide we've got here, Susan. Somewhere in there is the fact that down the bottom here, older workers generate demand for new or additional financial products and services as their working lives lengthen. And David Harris has mentioned today about annuities, and the question I would pose is, well, whose responsibility is it to try and influence the behaviour around annuities? Is it the commissions, or is it the industry itself? And that may be something to reflect on. Just very briefly, so the Ministry of ASD itself tried to put some value on the contribution that the ageing workforce is making back in 2015. Right, Alex?
We've updated it.
You've updated it? Excellent. Yeah, it's great. Excellent.
More or less the same.
Yeah, it's more or less the same, yeah? Yeah, but effectively trying to say that through the doubling of the tax take of this particular generation, around 3% currently, up to 8.9% contribution to GDP by the 2060. The increased participation rate is quite interesting because the first half of that graph, up to about there, if I'm right, reflects that that was the era in which New Zealand super qualification age was raised from 60 to 65. And so as a consequence of that and the loss of the surcharge, so it was no longer a penalty to have extra sources of income, the rates of participation increased. In the second half of the graph, where there's this explosion of the number of 65-plus-year-olds in the country, all of the same percentage rate for the numbers that are actually getting New Zealand super, and it was a question whether to what extent did changing the age of eligibility contribute to the participation in the workforce itself, because there's that incentive, isn't there, that if you can still work and get super, then why wouldn't you if you could, right? Do both, get both. Interestingly, the thing that interested me about this in relation to my research specialist, Celestina, was that the rate of participation for females has trebled effectively in the last 20 years, catching up to men, which may indicate that women are now finally getting greater opportunities for education, career development, etc. But I guess will always be subject possibly to more interruptions in the periods that they are responsible for giving birth and that sort of thing. So this is also from the updated stuff, I'm right, Alex? That overall, the 65-plus-year-old generation looking to contribute to the workforce through increased earnings, the value of unpaid or voluntary work, and the actual consumer spend and what that brings to the economy. And Brian Gaynor wrote a very telling article back in the Herald a few years ago about the grey workforce being good for our economy. My predecessor, who's here, the lovely David Boyle at the back there, had a lot to do with the he knows it. So one of the things that came out of the 2016 review was this need, in terms of the ageing workforce, to have the conversation, and the Commission was very big on saying there was a need for leadership and that sort of stuff, rather than try and deal with the ageing population through law change and policy and so forth. And so one of the fallouts from that is that with David and Paul Jarvie at the EMA, a dedicated workforce got together to produce that booklet you can see slightly there, and run through all the obvious benefits for the stakeholders, the government, the employer and the employees themselves in relation to this greying workplace. But the thing that hasn't changed is that the percentage of the businesses that we've surveyed who don't have anything specific in place for this ageing population or ageing workforce is still set at around the 82% mark. And I'm aware that the Commission itself, in terms of its SPEs, its specific performance expectations that it has with government, doesn't actually have any particular SPE charging it with the responsibility to influence that percentage rate. And it would be possibly something to think about, or who is responsible for trying to change the percentage rate so that that 82 comes down. Because I know certainly from the inherited work that I've done on behalf of the Commission and that David did such good work on, there are at least 10 other agencies involved in this aged workplace space. And even though we have a better later life strategy coming in shortly, there doesn't seem to be much actual activity, responsibility in the agencies themselves for changing that statistic to deal with the coming silvering of our workplace. We do know a little bit about the choice or necessity thing that Alex referred to before, both from 2016 work, which was indicative, and 2018 barometer testing. Around half of the 65 plus folk are remaining in the workforce through financial necessity. And down the bottom of that slide, 26% said in the latest barometer in 2018 we did that they just simply hadn't saved enough, reinforcing the idea of work as a necessity more than a choice without fiscal stresses involved. I'm obviously rushing to get through a lot of slides in a quick amount of time. For the people who were retired, again, Alex covered a lot of this, high dependencies on super as the main source of income, but an obvious need for an extra source of income, 49% at the bottom of 65 plus year olds using savings to supplement their super. The middle bullet point is a telling one that the source of those other savings, primarily in savings types, investments types, but not in Kiwisaver. So Kiwisaver not yet perceived perhaps as the go-to for retirement income, and I know my colleague Richard will be talking a bit about that shortly. More up to date, fortunately, and this is fresh off the press from the Commission really, what are the reasons that people are not in Kiwisaver? And the ones I've highlighted in yellow are quite telling, in my view anyway. 20% simply don't have income for whatever reason at the particular time, but 25% nearly have an income but can't afford Kiwisaver. And down further low in yellow, around almost 30% have other savings or investments that secure a comfortable retirement for them. So quite telling statistics there. In terms of the Kiwisaver recommendations that have been adopted, employer contributions are not going to be compulsory for the 65 plus, and there is a debate I guess you would have as well, was that discriminatory or not? An interesting part of the taxation bill commentary, if you read it on page 8, and I've made the quote here, we note, however, that more than 80% of people over 65 who are members of a Kiwisaver scheme currently receive employee contributions, even though it's not compulsory. And on that basis, that review did not see the need to amend that clause. But we haven't been able to find a source for the government's view of that 80%. And you contrast that to what the Commission's Ageing Workforce Survey found out in 2018 over on the right-hand side, is that, well, actually only 26% of workforce businesses are saying they definitely provide the employer contribution. 42% they don't, and there was some variation which only a data analyst could explain as to how businesses couldn't be sure if they had an employer contribution or not. But overall, there's a complete disparate measure there. What we know seems to be at odds with what the bill knows, and maybe facilitates that debate about should employer contributions carry on past 65? And I would put it to anybody who said that, well, how would you be able to do that in a way that is fair to private businesses, given the uncertain length of services of that demographic cohort? Just one thing on the recommendations adopted. Early in the day, Mike, I haven't met, but there was a concern raised about the absence of research-related data and that from the 2016 review, and I came to the Commission in 2015, but wasn't directly involved in that review, but saw an incredible amount of work that was done with it. And I'm a fairly simple man, but the basic takeaway from the 2016 review, whether it was evidence-based or not, is that politicians adopted quite a number of the recommendations, and I don't know how many recommendations they had adopted for previous reviews. So I did no judgment on that. It's an observation made as a passionate employee. Those changes of Kiwisaver are now out there in the workforce. Both the Kiwisaver website, IRD website, the banks, etc. All of those changes are now highly visible in the consumer eye. And just to go back to this question about whether employer contributions could or should be mandatory for those 65 and over who seek to join it, I cast the question, well, what is the actual benefit to anybody who's 65 or over looking to join a Kiwisaver scheme if there aren't going to be employer contributions, especially? Now, really, the only thing then is this tool that my colleague Tom Hartman, who's in the audience, is very familiar with. It's the Smart Investor, the Commission, you may or may not have seen it. But it does show that Kiwisaver funds, on average, have lower costs for investors than non-Kiwisaver types of saving options. And therefore, I guess you'd say that arguably that bottom bullet point, over 65s, had been stuck with higher priced options by being excluded from Kiwisaver historically, but that's not the case now, and that's probably the right segue to the next speaker, the financial advisor, who's talking more about cost.